Morning to the 27th meeting of 2025 of the Economy and Fair Work Committee. This morning we will be taking evidence as part of our pre-budget scrutiny from the Deputy First Minister, Kate Forbes. However, before I do so, I'd first of all just like to note apologies from... Yes, if everyone could turn their phones to silent, I probably should have said before that. Apologies from Willie Coffey and also from Sarah Boyack, who will be joining this committee. Moving on to agenda item 2, I'd just like to take a decision on taking business in private. I'd just also refer members to papers 1 and 2 in their information packs. Are we agreed that we will take items 4 and 5 in private this morning? Well, we are very pleased to have Deputy First Minister Kate Forbes, Cabinet Secretary for the Economy and Gaelic, alongside Colin Cook, Director of Economic Development, and Aidan Grisewood, Director of Jobs and Wellbeing Economy from the Scottish Government. I think we're going to just launch straight into questions. I just thought I might just open with an observation. So over recent weeks, we've been taking evidence from enterprise agencies and from the Scottish National Investment Bank. I mean, one thing that struck me is that they're clearly all doing lots of good work, attempting to take direct action and promote economic outcomes. My question is how well coordinated that activity is. They all seem to be reporting on different metrics in different ways. And if we compare ourselves internationally, there are some 1,300 people that work for Scottish Enterprise alone. That compares to around 700 people for Business Finland. Enterprise Singapore employs around 2,000. That's slightly less than the total number of people working across their enterprise agencies. Do we think we could do a better job of joining up that activity, and do we get a good bang for our buck from our enterprise agencies?
Well, thank you, Convener. There is a lot of questions in there. So let me start with the high-level perspective, that I don't think the enterprise agencies have ever been as strong as they are right now. And I say that on the basis of hard, cold data and evidence. So if you look at Scottish Enterprise's results, for example, during 2024 to 2025, they delivered the highest ever level of planned international sales, reaching an unprecedented £2.46 billion during 24 to 25, which is a 20% increase on the previous year. If you look at some of their other statistics, 15,000 new and safeguarded jobs, £442 million in business innovation investment, £1.16 billion in business capital expenditure, the second highest on record, and £367 million in growth funding leverage. That's just Scottish Enterprise, and I won't go through the data for the other enterprise agencies in the bank, because that would take some time. My point is that the figures, which we analyse very closely, are extremely strong, and that's what I want to see. I want to see what our investment in these enterprise agencies is delivering for Scottish business. The second thing, though, is you asked about collaboration. Now, you may recall about 9 years ago, there was extensive public discussion about whether or not, essentially, the enterprise agencies, this was prior to the bank existing, and at that time, the skills landscape should be brought into one organisation, or one loose organisation, and you may recall enormous backlash to it. That, I think, has delivered a far more independent and results-oriented enterprise agencies that would otherwise be the case. So if you take then Highlands and Islands Enterprise, which is one of the areas that I know quite closely, was driving the push against any enforced collaboration from government. Highlands and Islands Enterprise are doing sterling work, not just in terms of delivering the economic outputs and the data I could go through, but also being a leader in the Highlands and Islands economy to bring together all the different elements that drive economic growth and prosperity in the Highlands and Islands. So they, in collaboration with partners, are the ones who have quantified the scale of the investment over the next 10 years at £100 billion over the next 10 years, which is life sciences, it's energy, and so on. And I'm particularly interested in this question because of your interest, convener, in local government reform. And you have put to me on a number of occasions questions around mayoral authorities and local government reform more generally. And my argument would be that ultimately this comes down to strong leadership. And what you're seeing in Highlands and Islands Enterprise and South of Scotland Enterprise in particular is strong regional leadership that I would argue is delivering what you want to see from the mayoral authority model. So I've answered that in two ways. I've talked about Scottish Enterprise's strong results, and I've talked about the local regional leadership. If I could make one last point, which is there is still need for collaboration. And what I've been doing since coming back into government is driving that collaboration around particular outcomes that we want to see. So we have taken the question around attracting investment, and every quarter I get all the chief execs in a room, enterprise agencies, the bank, Crown Estate as well, SFT, and I get them all in a room to go through the structures within which they are operating together, but also the investment approach that they are taking and where the collaboration is. So I would say in the last year in particular, I have been driving that collaboration really intensely so that they can demonstrate that they're working together more closely. We shouldn't also forget the Office for Investment, because if we're talking about attracting investment, often an international investor is also engaging with the Office for Investment at a UK level. And I'm very pleased to say that the drive for collaboration across the enterprise agencies has also been pushing me to take a very proactive approach with the UK investment minister. I haven't met the new one, but I had a very good working relationship with Paul P. Gustafsson and also with the Office for Investment to make sure that it is as streamlined as possible so that a business that is trying to engage with the public sector has one gateway and then finds everything flows from that.
So in terms of the insight around kind of what drives kind of economic growth and regional approaches, and I wouldn't disagree particularly around the work that Hai and Susie do. I mean, I think they do an important job in terms of that agenda. However, while we wouldn't want all our enterprise agencies reporting on exactly the same things, that would be counterproductive, surely we should have them reporting on some of the same things so that we actually have some common points of reference, because it strikes me that we don't really have that. And secondly, beyond the sort of the metrics point, if you look at other countries, and most notably Sweden, who have been on a similar path, they have a comparable number of enterprise agencies, but then they also have an explicit Team Sweden programme whereby each of the agencies has a very, very clear understanding of what its interfaces are with the others. I mean, to the point where each of them articulates that clearly and explicitly on their website. So could we use just some more comparable ways of understanding and measuring outcomes, and should we, in a qualitative sense, be better at actually articulating where they fit together and where they collaborate together, as well as the areas where they do their own thing, so to speak?
So I think this may come down to a question of presentation, because by and large, my view is that the enterprise agencies are reporting on the same metrics. So in terms of planned international sales, for example, you can see the figures for the different enterprise agencies. The two caveats to that is, one, South Scotland Enterprise is at a different point in its own life cycle in terms of only still being relatively young and choosing where to focus its attention, but has got some very impressive statistics already. And the other one is that Hai, coming out of the Highlands and Islands Development Board, always had a big social focus. So, for example, there's still funding that goes through Highlands and Islands Enterprise into local development officers to a much greater extent than you would ever see in Scottish Enterprise for very obvious reasons. So I think it's important that there is still some regional variation, but on the presentational point of bringing together the key metrics like planned international sales, like investment, like innovation, there are quite a number of overlaps in terms of metrics, and I'll ask Colin to come in on that.
Yeah, I mean, just to build on that, I mean, we have a central sponsorship team within the Scottish Government that's responsible for sponsoring each of the agencies. So that's a collective point where they would come together. The guidance letters that determine the priorities from the agencies come from a single source. There's a lot of commonality between them. We meet, not only do we meet and assess their performance individually, but we have joint meetings with the enterprise agencies and indeed the Scottish National Investment Bank and sometimes some others. So there's a collective forum for discussing progress. And I think I'd also point to areas such as the development of offshore wind, where you see Scottish Enterprise and Highlands Enterprise collaborating on projects on the ground and working together to bring in investment. So I think in reality it's also working. Now that's not to say that we cannot improve the way in which we work with our agencies. We will always be looking to do that. It's not to say that we will not assess that in the context of future public service reform and the degree to which we can strengthen regional economic partnerships. But I do think the processes are in place to drive a consistent view behind Scotland's economic priorities as defined in the national strategy.
Thank you very much. I'd like to hand over to the Deputy Convener.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us. I wanted to return to a theme of mine, which I suspect will not surprise you, and that is representation of women. And I know this is an area that's important to yourself as well, Deputy First Minister, and we see ample evidence of that. Some of the stats you brought out in terms of your tech scaler update yesterday, the work you've done with Anna Stewart. In readiness for this meeting, I was revisiting the information about NZ, and it re-triggered a frustration that in terms of the data set, I found it impossible to find the disaggregated data that showed me exactly what the position was in a whole variety of measures specifically for women. And I'm wondering why we're still at that stage, because I know, and the record will show that I've asked that question, not just of yourself, but other people. Why is it so difficult?
Thank you. And I know that this is a recurring issue. I felt when you said that I might guess where you were going. It was one of two areas. And you managed to combine both areas in one question. So I was right in that regard. So I understand Michelle Thompson's long-standing frustration with questions of data. And I will ask, I think, Aidan Gricewood, if there's anything further to add on this. We just published our third NSET report. Mm-hmm. That is the third annual report. By and large, what we are analysing from a government perspective is whether or not we've delivered what we've said we're going to deliver. And what isn't in that report, to the extent that I know Michelle Thompson would like, is the analysis of whether or not what we've delivered is actually having the positive impact across different metrics. Now, there is a point there around saying we should do that probably later down the line when these so pathways are still being rolled out and so on. We do have some really good granular data on particular areas of focus. So TechScaler is the most obvious one. Where there are more recent initiatives that have been established, we've established them with a data-first approach. So with TechScaler, we have very granular data. And I'd be very happy to send the committee the more granular data than ever makes it onto websites, because that might be an area of interest. But the member is, Michelle Thompson's absolutely right to say, TechScaler shows up, as it were, all the other initiatives that haven't been established with a data-first approach. And the data is still lacking.
OK, so why? is that the case? And you may, and I'd be entirely happy if you referred to either of your officials there, because I know I have asked this before, how we focus on what we measure. And by continuing to not measure or collect the data, we end up with a very skewed picture. And having read the update the other day, I got quite excited when I saw a bit about case study for women, and then it just drifted off into other irrelevant stuff. And it looked as though it was a bit of a fop. We better stick something in here rather than a systemic approach. And in fairness, I would concede it's not just data about women, it's disaggregated data in general terms. There could be other areas where it could be very vital. I mean, we've just had this conversation about the different enterprise agencies where we know that having the data in different areas gives that kind of, those different insights that are so important. But it's a general frustration because some of the things, like we know that, you know, the measure for the gender pay gap excludes part-time workers. The vast majority of them are likely to be women. Income tax receipts, income inequality, entrepreneurial early stage activity, 3-year survival rates. I want to know how that is for women. So why not?
Mm-hmm. I think too, and I'll bring in Aidan, it's about it is sometimes a question too of presentation. So where we have very disparate programmes, trying to bring them together in one place. So, for example, we also have quite good granular data on gender in and around some of the employability schemes. So in and around employability schemes, we've got some on TechScaler, but those are just sitting as individual pots rather than being brought together. Aidan, any thoughts?
Yeah, so I think, there's more we can do here. I agree. And I think in terms of the annual report, we try to keep that pretty consistent each year. So I think a reflection for me is just the extent to which we, as you say, extend that to include more disaggregated data on particular things where we've got new data. So there's a principle of keeping the goalposts the same, and, you know, making sure that we do that, but actually making that more rich in terms of equalities data. So I think we could probably just provide you with more information that we've got in terms of some of those key metrics within the report that isn't necessarily set out there. I was going to flag employability data as a good example where we've just got more and more granular actually as we've gone on, including in terms of things like impact on child poverty and their sort of priority groups in terms of impact around that as well, just to make sure that we're making the biggest difference. And actually that's been really helpful, challenging, but actually really helpful now in terms of making sure that we do more to target ethnic minority groups, for example, where we were evidently underreaching there previously. Enterprise I'm less close to. I know there's been a lot of work on TechScalers, and I know that the team have been working busily on the back of some of your previous questions around this in terms of what more could be done on that. So I suspect there's just not. There's data there, but it's not reported. I think in other areas, there's stuff that's UK-wide. So I think sort of some of those entrepreneurial data is not necessarily always data. We're reliant on sort of international comparisons and UK-wide metrics as well. So there's probably something around that as well.
What we could do, convener, if it's of interest, is we could follow up in writing just with a list of all the areas where I am confident we are collating data that reveals gender figures. So basically where that level of granularity is, which will allow you to see where the areas that still need some work on. So if that's useful, and it may not be because you're looking quizzical.
I am, because we have to be as interested in those areas. I mean, because you're obviously going to proffer the positive. I'm interested in those areas where we are utterly blindsided and challenging those areas where we're utterly blindsided and why we're still in that position. And I mean, I know when we've discussed this before, I am not trying to create an industry around data gathering, because I know how complex and time consuming and the checking. I understand that. But I just think routinely for certain measures, and I totally accept what you're saying about TechScaler, I mean, the evidence is apparent to me, and I can see, you know, you being behind that, Deputy First Minister, but in so many other areas, it's almost as though it doesn't occur to the government that we might want to be able to slice and dice this data to proffer different perspectives, and that's utterly fundamental. And the reason I care so passionately about this is not necessarily just because of inequalities, it's actually about economic contribution, which I suspect is why you care so passionately about it. In the face of chronic labour shortages, we cannot afford to be complacent.
I will, if it's okay, Convener, too, I think share with you some of the granular employability data, because a lot of that is linked with some of the other points that Michelle Thompson has mentioned. So it has an impact on, ultimately, employment. It has an impact on, you know, challenges for women that basically, whether or not somebody goes through an employability scheme and then stays in work a year later is nearly always indicative of the wider pressures. So there may be something interesting in relation to that. Colin, did you have anything?
No, I mean, this is not an answer on the specifics of data collection, but you'll be aware that we do have specific initiatives to try and redress some of those historic underrepresentation of women and indeed other underrepresented groups in employability and in entrepreneurship in particular. We have our Pathways Fund, and successful applicants will know about whether they've been successful later this week. So there are activities happening. We work very closely with Anna Stewart, the Chief Entrepreneur, on this. I know she does a lot of work not only within the context of government, but within wider private sector initiatives that she does. So it is a focus. It is something we're talking about constantly, and we are trying to challenge ourselves, and we will undertake that work that Deputy First Minister mentioned.
And again, I understand that very clearly, and the work that Anna Stewart is doing is fantastic. But I suppose it goes back to a point that the Deputy First Minister made, you know, about where you get these insights. There was some work commissioned by Women's Enterprise Scotland, which I think the Scottish Government was behind, that looked at the kind of issues of female business leaders experiencing burnout. And actually, some of her key findings were that on an ongoing basis, the lack of access to capital for women entrepreneurs over a long period of time. Now, it's funny, the survey started up ostensibly about one thing, but actually gave a critical insight into something we know is an issue. So it's always having that lens, because we cannot afford to let so many of our population not contribute to our economy. And we've got such a compelling mission as set out in NZ.
Yeah, I don't disagree at all. So it's not an area that we have been neglecting in between committee appearances, but it is an area which is got lots of challenges to it. So that's not an excuse. But we will come back as comprehensively as we can in writing about where we have disaggregated gender data and share that with the committee.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I'd now like to hand over to Stephen Kerr.
Yeah, I think Michelle's, we focus on what we measure, should probably be enthroned above every doorway in every office of government and probably every organisation. So in the spirit of that, let me kind of give you a softball first question, Deputy First Minister. Yeah, I'm going to build up to something more. But we're just days away from Scotland's Global Investment Summit. Yes. And in the spirit of Michelle's reminder, what are we focused on and what can we expect in terms of deliverables from a Scottish Government perspective?
Yes. So, can I make one point which the member will know already, but it's obviously industry-led investment summit, which I am delighted about because it means that it is the City of London and Scottish Financial Enterprise really maximising their networks with the support of both governments. So what do we want to get out of this? I think there's a couple of things. One is as part of, so you'll know in terms of my approach to investment, there's kind of three areas that I've been trying to improve on. One of the areas is targeted and more strategic approach to investors. So we're really good at speaking to the people we know about. We're not as good as speaking to the people that we don't know. And what we are anticipating at next week's investment summit is a lot of investors that have not been active in Scotland or are interested in getting into Scotland. I've had some engagement this week alone with some of those who are looking to Scotland for the first time. So on that first pillar of more strategic, targeted engagement with those that we don't know yet, that I hope will be one of the results. So it's the relationship, investor relationship part. Secondly is the showcasing Scotland. So I think there's a lot of familiarity about areas of Scotland that are open for investment. I think it's pretty well known that we're making the energy transition. I think it's pretty well known that we've got big industries like whisky and salmon as well. But what about our life sciences industry? Well, we're going to showcase that. What about what we're trying to do in and around attracting private investment for housing? We can showcase that. So we can showcase to those that know us and those that don't know us new areas of interest. Now, that is not the end of the game. That is just revealing what's available. So the third area is the area that I'm most interested in, which is how do we build on the relationships that are established next week and follow up. And what my approach is, you have the initial conversation with a potential investor, but actually it's not the politician that does the deal. You then bring in the experts in government, and often that's with private sector as well, with those investors, say, what is it that they need? Is it some sort of public-private structured arrangement? Is it the fact that there's lots of hurdles in their way and they need some help from us to knock down those hurdles? Is it contacts? So I think the follow-up is the most critical element. So what would I like to get out of this? I would like to see, probably not next week, but in 6 months to a year's time, being able to identify significant millions that have been pledged as investment in Scotland as a result of those early conversations.
Okay, so in terms of immediate return, maybe a lot of good relationship networking, but down the line, you're expecting tens of millions, hundreds of millions?
I always orientate my thinking
bigger
around the
numbers.
billions, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
I know that next week we will have sovereign wealth funds, we will have pension funds, we will have national representation of billions.
It's a big moment for the Scottish economy.
It's a big moment.
Yeah. Let's see if we can agree on something else then. Productivity.
Yeah.
Do we agree that it's the single most important driver of growth, living standards, public service funding?
It's certainly one of them. If it's certainly up there, near the top, if not the top.
If not the top. Right, so we kind of agree on that. How much money does this area of your portfolio spend?
Yeah.
How much have you got? It's about $1 billion, isn't it?
Well, in terms of my overall...
In the economy brief.
It's probably a little bit less if you're talking about revenue funding, unless somebody's got the figures to hand.
No.
But it's probably a little bit less in terms of revenue.
I think it's roughly about $1 billion a year.
I'd quite like to have £1 billion,
Yeah.
but that's... I think in terms of productivity, the thing with productivity is you can't deliver productivity only through public spend. One of the challenges that Scotland has had for so long is incentivising business investment in productivity.
I want to come on to that because obviously we're spending roughly £1 billion a year, say, in that area, and yet if we agree, and I think we kind of do, that productivity is the most important driver, we haven't seen over the last 10 years, perhaps even longer, we haven't seen any remarkable improvements. We see some economies around the world where there's tremendous leaps forward in terms of national productivity. But in Scotland, although there's a little bit of improvement, we've really not covered ourselves in glory in that respect. So can I ask you specifically in relation to that about the number of businesses that we have in Scotland? So over the last 5 years, the number of businesses in Scotland has actually fallen by about 5%. What do you put that down to?
I think the last 5 years have been extremely challenging for businesses. I think that what you've seen in terms of higher costs has made it extremely challenging for businesses. and whether that's energy costs or more recently hike in national insurance contributions, although I think the impact of that will be seen in years to come. So I think it has been enormously challenging, and I think a lot of businesses struggled hugely through COVID, and some of them very unfortunately didn't make it.
And there's a churn, obviously there's a churn in businesses, in terms of the life cycle of businesses. But one of the areas that we've not done very well in terms of boosting our economy, and particularly productivity, is around new businesses. Because we roughly are creating new businesses over a 10-year period, at less than half the rate of the rest of the United Kingdom. That's going to have a negative impact on our ability to be a productive economy. What do you put that down to?
Well, and yet, if you look at the figures for the first half of this year...
This year, yeah, I give you this year, but I'm
first
looking
half
over
of
10
this year,
years.
Obviously, we were second only to the northeast of England, and in 2025 there has been an 18% increase in new business incorporations.
Yeah, I'm looking over a decade, which I think is a realistic purview of these sorts of statistics and the dynamics.
It has been a challenging decade for a lot of businesses. It's been a challenging decade for the economy. Would be my view. And ultimately, I think it points to the need for a diversified economy in Scotland. So if you look at the rest of the UK, and you always see this in the income tax figures, Scotland's got some big beasts in terms of its industry. So it's got a big beast in the form of financial enterprise, it's got a big beast in the form of energy.
There's about 100 companies, isn't there, that kind of drive...
Big beasts.
Yeah.
Which means that when either of those sectors are affected, it has a disproportionate impact on the Scottish economy. Indeed. In a way that, let's take England, it is less dependent on its big beasts. It's more diversified. Yeah. And it's been particularly challenging for those two industries in the last 10 years. So do you think that it means that economic headwinds has a disproportionate effect in Scotland because of its reliance on some of the bigger industries?
And another way of saying that is that we have a very high level, about 99-point-something% of our businesses are all SMEs. Yeah. And so when we're talking about the £1 billion, I hope you can understand what I'm trying to get to, the £1 billion that we're roughly spending in these areas every year, and yet we're not making much progress on national productivity, and we've got, challenges with business survival, and we've got these SMEs, so that the crux, the bulk of the people that work in the economy are working in these private SMEs. Sorry, did you?
So I think, it'd be interesting, because I need to come back to you on the data on that. There are a lot of small businesses, but by and large, the bulk of the workforce are still working for the bigger businesses.
I think you'll find that it may be the other way around, but we can swap data on that again. The point is there is a very important place that SMEs play in the economy, Absolutely. And that's a really difficult nut to crack, as has been shown. So in terms of the money that the government's spending to try and drive productivity, because I think it is the key driver, we're not making headway. And I suppose when we're looking at this from a budgetary point of view, we're asking ourselves, well, where are the issues and what are the value for money problems? Because we're clearly not getting the £1 billion bang in this area. Well, what's your analysis?
Let me go further than that. So I agree that SMEs are the backbone of the Scottish economy. Yeah. I also agree that productivity is critical. So let's unpack what drives productivity growth. Yeah. Technology. So the adoption of digital technology. Secondly, skills. In other words, people having the right skills, being in the right job, being able to perform at the level that they need to perform. And then, I think you're coming on to it, but business investment, business reinvesting its profits. There's three drivers of productivity. There's other drivers as well. Infrastructure. So immediately you've gone, and my overall budget, if you include capital, is £1.3 billion. So immediately, if you you have to go broader than just my portfolio. So you have to look at skills, training, you have to look at wider infrastructure investment, and you also have to look at digital adoption. So I can do things like support digitalisation, digital adoption, supporting, when I say the tech industry, bear in mind that most industries are now a tech industry. It's not just so I talked yesterday about med tech, for example, growing. So I think it's much broader than the £1.3 billion. And I think our £1.3 billion is delivering significant results.
I completely agree with you. I mean, this is not just about one portfolio. This is about the whole direction of government. But when you talk about digital, for example, and digital skills, absolutely critical. 21%, according to the latest data I've got here, 21% of firms say their staff are fully equipped with digital skills. 21%.
Yeah.
I mean, that therein lies a clue as to why we're struggling to move the productivity needle, doesn't it?
Well,
but yet that's a government priority. I think £100 million was committed to digital skills.
So we did have, prior to COVID, we had the Digital Boost, and I think that's come up at committee previously, the Digital Boost scheme, which was quite low-level, entry-level support for digitalisation.
Which is what's needed.
We've now moved into how far can we support businesses and the public sector. Public sector is a big question around productivity as well. Is in other words, a big contributor to productivity. How we can support them through areas like AI, which for some businesses will be second nature to adopting or working with, but with other businesses it's extremely foreign. And so supporting businesses, so Richard Lochhead is leading the AI Scotland programme to try and support businesses. So you're absolutely right. I actually think there's a lot more agreement here than anything else. It does beg the question about the how.
Well, that's what I'm trying to drive at here, because what we've been doing up until now has not had the significant impact that we all want to see in terms of return for the public funds that we're talking about in budget terms. But what do we do about this? 1 in 5 adults lack digital capability. Well, I mean, so what we've been doing hasn't been making any difference. I suppose looking to you as the Deputy First Minister and saying, so what's the next set of ideas?
Yeah. So I do think that these things have, so I might disagree with the premise. I do think that these, the approaches that we've taken have had an impact. So Scotland's productivity has outperformed all regions of the UK over a 20-year period, recording an average growth of real output per hour of 1.5% per annum. Despite that, productivity is still below the national average, and that is what we need to focus on. So my argument would be that actually what we've been doing has had an impact, but we need to recognise that the current challenges that businesses are facing right now requires a slightly different approach.
Yes.
So AI is a new opportunity and challenge.
So on that, business investment. So this is a particularly difficult problem for us in Scotland, because our business investment percentages are among the lowest in the OECD.
Yeah.
So I want to hear what it is we're going to do differently from a Scottish Government perspective.
So
it's going to change this.
So three things. Yeah. Businesses are always more likely to invest when their costs are lower. Yeah. So if businesses are spending more on national insurance contributions, as one example, they're less inclined to reinvest their profits. So the first thing is to support business by giving them a bit of breathing space to actually reinvest in productivity, because that is a business choice to reinvest in productivity. There's also something around demonstrating the benefit to the business of reinvesting in productivity. Some of the headwinds that we are experiencing right now, particularly where it's affecting labour shortages, are already driving businesses to reinvest, because you have to reinvest in technology if you can't recruit. So that's point number one.
Yeah.
Point number two is supporting businesses to transition to the new world within which we operate. Huge focus on that in 2018, 2019, 2020, on things like Digital Boost, through Business Gateway, with their adoption of technology. COVID drove that exponentially higher, where businesses had to adapt anyway. But we're now facing new challenges around AI, and I've already talked about what Richard Lochhead is doing in and around supporting businesses with AI. Thirdly, there's what businesses can do internally amongst sectors. So we already support a number of initiatives. For example, in the advanced manufacturing sector, we have got the National Manufacturing Institute for Scotland, NMIS. Their job is to support innovation in manufacturing across all businesses that operate in that sector. couple of weeks ago, I launched the Deep Tech Supercluster, which is all about getting businesses to embrace technology. We're doing a 6-month pilot at the moment. So where you get different sectors that need to embrace a more technological approach to things. So there's 3 examples of what can be done, is being done, but it can't be public sector led alone.
I'm getting the signal from the convener. I think we could talk about this for a very long time because there's so much to unpack in terms of innovation active companies. And the problem that I think we have to acknowledge that we have with Glasgow as a major city, it is so below all of the averages in all the areas that make a difference in terms of local productivity, but also national productivity. But we don't have time.
No.
Maybe I'll...
And if we do have time, there's some points around data points which might be useful, but I think we need to move on for now. Can I bring in Lorna Slater?
Thank you, Convener. I've got 3 questions for the Deputy First Minister today. The first one is sort of in the bigger picture about how NSET enables government stated intentions on climate and nature. And the reason I'm asking this is because there's a general concern with this committee that government policy isn't always coherent. Government sets out a sort of constellation of intentions and then a budget and then the NSET, but doesn't point out or indicate how NSET is going to meet these things. Now, my specific interest is in climate and nature targets. The Scottish Government will be imminently moving to carbon budgets. So as the Parliament holds the government to account on financial budgets, we will also start holding the government to account on carbon budgets, which means that the same questions we ask about how much did this cost for any initiative, we will also ask how much carbon did this emit or how much carbon did this sequester, because that budget will now have to be part of your accounting for every decision. So my question is, with the NSET going forward, how are you going to do those 2 budgets alongside one another in terms of the financial budget and that carbon budget?
So in terms of NSET, just for definition purposes, I see NSET in terms of its 6 pillars, and I see that as being the 6 pillars for the entire Economy Directorate. So we could use basically our economic strategy as a proxy for NSET. So in terms of our economic strategy, and this is what I communicate to all of our enterprise agencies and anyone who has a responsibility for delivering our economic strategy, that we have to focus in on the government's priorities as stated in NSET. Now, some of those have sort of the climate approach inherent in their stated aim. Some of them, it might be more difficult to see how skilled work is explicitly a climate objective, but is still obviously critical to getting to our net zero objectives. Those objectives are going to have to fit within the carbon budgets and the financial budget. So the exercise, we've set out what our economic strategy is. That is what I expect all parts of the public sector to be delivering. They are all going to have to fit into a financial budget and a carbon budget. On the financial budget, it's a challenge every year. It's a challenge. There's always more that you want to do than you can do. And I think that could be also applied to the carbon budgets. Every year, there's always going to be more that we want to do than we can do. So we have to fit it into the carbon budget. We're at the very early stages of the budget process in terms of financial budget. I've got a long list of things I would like to see. I doubt I'll be able to get every single one of them into the full cost that I want to, but what we try and do is deliver as much of it as possible. And that means you have to prioritise, and you can only prioritise in terms of your stated aims. So I think, for me, it's actually quite a clear process because we've got both budgeting processes running in parallel. I know what we need to achieve in terms of our 6 stated aims, and those budget processes need to be able to deliver on those aims, but within the envelopes that we'll have, because the envelope is just not, it's not unlimited.
So what I'm hearing from you, DFM, is that you do intend to run a carbon budgeting process alongside the sort of annual budgeting process to ensure that all government policy that you are responsible for, at least, fit within a carbon budget?
Well, we have obviously got Gillian Martin has laid out our approach to the climate change plan. We also obviously have the advice from the CCC in terms of carbon budgets.
Much of what the Scottish Government rejected.
And we will have to demonstrate how every part of government is in accordance with the climate change plan. And so that's the approach that we will take, and the Economy Directorate is not immune from being part of that process.
Thank you. Okay, my next question is a slightly different approach. Recently, this committee looked at the Community Wealth Building Bill at stage 1. Now, on the face of that bill has two purposes. One is to reduce inequality. The other is to support economic growth. Now, when the Minister Ivan McKee was in, I asked him what he meant by economic growth on the face of the bill, because what we heard from all of our witnesses was that GDP is not a good measure of economic success, certainly not in the community wealth building sense. And so I asked him, is that what he intended? Did he mean by economic growth on the face of the community wealth building bill an increase in GDP? And he said that wasn't necessarily what he intended. So that's my question to you. If economic growth is not an increase in GDP, what is it?
So I will, I'm afraid, say that I do think GDP remains a useful indicator of economic growth, but I don't think it is the only indicator of economic growth, largely because it is measured on a national basis. And the whole point of community wealth building is that you want to understand the drivers of local prosperity. You want to know that where a particular local community are thriving, it's having an obvious social impact. So that is what he was probably getting at, though I didn't see the exchange. But GDP remains useful, but on a community level, I think there are a number of metrics that can be used. He's driving the bill, so he will obviously be doing the consultation. But there's a number of useful metrics in terms of unemployment, economic inactivity, poverty is a massive indicator of economic prosperity. There will be statistics in and around the number of businesses. I imagine each of those local businesses contributing to sort of more local infrastructure development and so on. So I think there's a lot of metrics, and I'm assuming that as part of the community wealth building consultation process and bill process, there'll be a lot of discussions about how you measure the wealth that you want to see communities build through that bill.
That's absolutely the case, Deputy First Minister. And the reason I'm asking this is because I have sort of some of the same challenges around NSET with this focus on growth. But if, as you say, it isn't all about GDP, when we talk about growth in the media, it is about GDP. But you're actually saying it's more about prosperity. It's about it's about unemployment. It's about these other measures. So would it be better, more clear to say that we are looking at economic prosperity or economic success rather than that very measure of economic growth? And I know people use growth as a synonym for success, but it isn't a synonym, and it's unclear then what metrics we're going to be using. It seems to imply that GDP is the only metric, which you've just said is not your intention.
So I always think that there's two perspectives on economic success. There is the perspective that if you just pick a couple of big winners, it drives national GDP growth that looks really good and hides all the challenges, the social challenges, the communities feeling left behind, the disenfranchisement. The other perspective is ground up, which is you want to ensure that all parts of Scotland are economically prosperous, which inevitably drives GDP growth. So GDP growth still remains a useful indicator, but if you're not comparing it with the other statistics that you have at your disposal, you don't know whether it's just masking a lot of lack of economic prosperity in communities. And I think we have seen that in the past, where communities got left behind, but the national figures still looked okay. But the national figures would have been a lot better if we hadn't left communities behind. So I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a both and. and those that only focus on national GDP figures to the exclusion of other figures do themselves a disservice, and those that only look at the local figures without understanding how it's driving the national figures also do themselves a disservice.
So just for my final question on this theme is, how does the NSET therefore enable a well-being economy rather than simply this pursuit of GDP to the potential detriment of, as you say, the local economy?
Yeah, so in terms of the metrics, in fact, why don't I just ask Aidan to speak to the metrics, because we have the metrics, I think, that are doing that.
Yeah, so just on specific metrics, I guess just in terms of NSET, just that commitment to annual report and around the balance of metrics across the piece, so including income inequality, regional inequality, emissions, natural capital index, which I know is sort of developing over time, but speaks to what you're saying in terms of just making sure that in terms of natural assets they're covered, as well as GDP growth and linked to that income tax receipts as well. So just that balanced overall metric set is, at the heart of NSET and something we still report on annually. And as the Deputy First Minister said, there's different parts of NSET that not just only achieve one of those aims, but multiple ones of those aims alongside all of that. I guess there's just ongoing work to make sure that we can measure the impact of what we're doing properly, and we have various impact assessments that enable that to work. And there'll be some specific examples in the NSET report of where we do that, just to make sure that we're getting the breadth of impacts covered, reflected in those national indicators, as well as the specific indicators such as growth or GVA, which we talked about earlier.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Very much. Lorna, I'd like to hand the floor to Murdo Fraser.
Thank you. Good morning, Deputy First Minister. I've got three things I'd like to ask, which all arise from evidence we've taken over the past couple of weeks as a committee. And I want to start by asking about support for businesses in the defence sector. And defence, as you know, is a key strength of the Scottish economy. It's one where we've seen quite a lot of very good news recently in terms of winning international orders. And it is an area where the opportunity for growth is very substantial because of the international situation and the fact that right across the Western world, countries are increasing defence expenditure. So in an area where we have expertise and knowledge and experience, we can do much better. Now, the Scottish Government have now dropped the previous policy about not funding munitions, so I'm not going to ask you about that because that's past history. But there's a new policy in place in relation to not supporting companies who might have a connection with exports to Israel. And I asked Scottish Enterprise about this when they came in on the 17th of September. And I think from their answers, I don't think they are particularly clear about where that policy sits, because what was said to me in response to my questions from Adrian Gillespie, he said, we are working through the implications of the changes that have been made recently. We need to work through which companies are affected by that. So I wonder if you can be clear, what exactly is the Scottish Government policy and what is the practical impact of that in terms of support from public bodies like Scottish Enterprise, Skills Development Scotland and others?
Yeah. So, happily, and I'm assuming that the enterprise agencies also were fulsome in expressing how much financial support they have given to defence companies over the last few years. I think, if memory serves, Scottish Enterprise and Highlands and Islands Enterprise have given about £45 million of financial support to companies in the defence sector. In terms of the policy that the First Minister announced a couple of weeks ago, and it is only a few weeks ago, which I don't know when you took evidence from the enterprise agencies, but I imagine it was quite soon after the announcement. So the policy applies to new grants provided or investments made by Scottish Government, Scottish Enterprise, Highlands and Islands Enterprise, South Scotland Enterprise and the Scottish National Investment Bank. And named countries determined by ministers in reference to objective international legal processes, specifically where the International Court of Justice has indicated provisional measures under the Genocide Convention or the International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for related acts. Those countries are currently Myanmar and Israel. The policy will only apply to companies, as defined above, whose products or services are provided to specific identified countries, either directly or through known indirect relationships, such as distributors, intermediaries or broader supply chains, and the policy does not apply to companies whose goods and services end up in those countries without their knowledge, and the policy applies to the full global footprint of a defence company and all associated activities. That is the technical detail of the policy.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. So let me ask you to illustrate that with an example, if you can, because you'll be very familiar with Leonardo in Edinburgh, who are a very large defence contractor, and they supply radar systems, including to Lockheed Martin, and they've been criticised in the past because some of these Lockheed Martin planes will end up in Israel. So would your policy mean that a company like Leonardo could not be supported through the public bodies you refer to?
Well, there would be two steps to take. The first is that it is for the company itself to essentially declare that, to the best of its knowledge, its products are not being used in those countries. So it's a self-declaration process. And secondly, the enterprise agency would engage with them to understand the full detail. So I am not going to give you the joy and delight of expressing a view on a hypothetical application in committee, because I think there's a very important process to take place. I don't know, Colin, if there's anything to add to any of that.
No, I would probably just add, I said earlier that I'm at an official level, I'm the sponsor of our enterprise agencies. We're currently working with them. I met Scottish Enterprise yesterday to try and go through some of the practical issues that have come up as they've thought through the policy on the ground. We are addressing those one by one. There's nothing unusual in that process. We'd do that with any government policy, making sure that the enterprise agencies understand the implications and that we take feedback about how it's operating in practice. So we're working on that process, and we're also in continual discussions with the defence industry. I attend the industry leadership group of the aerospace industry. The Deputy First Minister, I think, is attending next week to have those discussions. So we're having live discussions about the practical implementation of the policy.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. One of the issues I explored with Scottish Enterprise was the complexity of supply chains. And a lot of these international exports are sourced from a whole variety of different companies. So in the scenario that I outlined with Leonardo, where undoubtedly some of their output may well end up in Israel, would that also apply to subcontractors to them, somebody who supplies components, somebody who provides training facilities to their staff, for example? Would they also be impacted by this?
The policy does not apply to supply chain companies working for companies with links to identified countries if the project that they are subcontracted to work on is not intended for use in those countries, which is why it all comes back to a self-declaration by the company that, to the best of their knowledge, that is not the primary purpose or the intended destination.
Okay, all right, thank you. Let me ask you a second question, again arising from some of the evidence we took. We took evidence last week from the Scottish National Investment Bank, and I asked them about a specific investment they have made in Gresham House. Now, Gresham House are the largest commercial forester in the United Kingdom. They are now, I believe, Scotland's second largest landowner. So they're a very substantial enterprise. They have assets under management worth 8.7 billion, and they have an ambition to grow that to 200 billion by 2030. And Scottish National Investment Bank had given them 50 million of public money to assist with the purchase of an estate in the borders, Todrig and Whiteslade. Why do we need to be spending taxpayers' money supporting such a large organisation to purchase land?
So the temptation for me to comment on this is quite significant, but the Scottish National Investment Bank is operationally independent, and the moment I start to pass comment on the commercial decisions that they take, that's compromised. So there will be investments that they make out of their independent position that members think are a great idea. There are other investments that other members may think are not such a great idea. And the whole point is it's free from political interference, and that is what makes the Scottish National Investment Bank such an impactful investor. And I do not want to compromise that. What we have set out very clearly is the 3 missions that the bank is to focus on. Those are, of course, a just transition to net zero carbon emissions by 2045. I think forestry may have something to do with getting to net zero. Secondly, extending quality of opportunity through improving places, so a place-based approach, and then harnessing innovation to enable our people to flourish by 2040. They are by design not prescriptive, so that, again, the bank knows that there's a parameter within which it operates, but it is free to make investment decisions independently of government.
Okay, thank you for that. I mean, the reason I asked the question is we were told by Willie Watt from SNIB that the reason they made the investment was because this was promoting biodiversity and there'd be a higher percentage of non-commercial woodland in that site. Information I've been given since then by our former colleague Andy Whiteman suggests that might not be the case, but perhaps that's something the committee can follow up directly with SNIB. Right, let me ask you one more question if I can, which is something directly in your portfolio, and that is the visitor levy. So we took evidence on this 3 weeks ago as a committee. There's been a bit of toing and froing you'll be very familiar with in terms of correspondence that came to the committee last week from Ivan McKee, which was then contradicted. Can you tell us exactly where the Scottish Government are now in terms of potential changes to the visitor levy to allow councils the freedom to introduce a flat charge as opposed to a percentage?
So can I caveat all of this by saying I'm excused, we'll answer the question, but I'm excused from decisions on this because of a register of interest in accommodation provision through family members. Visitor levy, I am intimately familiar with all the arguments, however, as a Highland MSP. And the government's position is that through engagement with local authorities and with businesses, there's obviously been a number of points highlighted in terms of the implementation. When the issue of the nature of the levy was consulted on, if memory serves, it was about 50-50 in favour of percentage rates versus flat rates. Highland Council, for example, wanted neither. They wanted a tiered flat rate. And the STA, I think, have favoured in the past publicly a tiered flat rate. And so the government has been open to exploring the implementation of changes that have been requested by local authorities and by industry. The challenge is finding a legislative mechanism to do that, because time is very tight over the next 6 months. So I think there's an appetite, a willingness, a keenness to find a route to offer local authorities the option of a flat rate, of levying a flat rate rather than a percentage rate. The question is means. Now, there's quite a sensitive conversation around how to link that with housing, which is why I imagine it didn't happen through the housing bill, because generally tourism businesses don't want to see the levy used for what they believe are statutory obligations on the state. They want to see the funding being used to improve visitor facilities. But there's certainly an openness from government and very active conversations with industry and local authorities to look at how we do it.
Yeah, so I believe there were amendments put forward to the housing bill that the presiding officer decided were not in scope. And I
think one of your colleagues also did that too.
Absolutely correct. And those were ruled out, and that might have been an opportunity to do something about this. Okay, so we currently have, I believe we've got 5 councils now that have looked at this and have decided not to proceed or to pause. And when Argyll and Bute met last week, I understand one of the reasons they decided to pause was because of the confusion, because they didn't want to take a decision until they knew where this was going to end up. Do you think it would be sensible, therefore, to have a moratorium on any further decisions being taken? Because we don't currently know what the options might be.
No, I don't think it's sensible to have a moratorium that is instituted by government, because this has always been a local tax, so it is for local authorities. COSLA, again, this is going into the deep recesses of my mind. I think in terms of COSLA's feedback to the consultation, I don't think they came out, for example, unilaterally in favour of a flat rate. And some of their local authorities are quite keen to make progress with the current arrangements, like City of Edinburgh. Others, like Highland Council, want neither a flat rate nor a percentage rate. They want a tiered rate. In other words, I don't think a moratorium from central government is in the spirit or the letter of this policy or legislation.
Okay, can I ask just one more question on this? So from today, businesses in Edinburgh have to charge the visitor levy for bookings into next year. Now, an Edinburgh colleague of mine has passed to me a communication they got from constituents who run a caravan park in the Lothians, who take their bookings through booking.com. And they've just been told by booking.com that while they can institute the visitor levy on top of bookings that are made, they cannot deal with the situation with the visitor levy being capped at 5 consecutive nights. So if somebody books for 7 nights or 14 nights, booking.com are saying they have to apply the visitor levy on the total sum. And they're then suggesting that the business has to refund to their guests on departure the balance. That's a bit of a burek, isn't it?
So the legislation is extremely flexible. And the point here is that local authorities must, under the legislation, consult extensively with industry and introduce, if they wish, a scheme that is operational. In other words, it can actually be implemented. And I would assume, on the basis of that communication, that there's a point there that needs to be highlighted to local authorities about the way in which they levy this visitor levy. So I think, for me, that is a question of operational implementation and fundamentally a question for City of Edinburgh Council, who should be consulting currently, as we speak, with industry to know how to do this.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you. Before we move on, can I just ask a couple of brief supplementaries relating to the defence questions that came up? First of all, I was just wondering if you could share with the committee the detail that you seem to be referencing regarding supply chain companies. That would be just quite useful if we could get that in writing and on the record, because I think that's an important bit of clarification. And then one direct question is: a number of these companies are designated as sovereign capabilities, which means there's actually quite robust Chinese walls and separation. You know, I believe Leonardo is designated as such. Thales in Glasgow. Is that been taken into cognizance in terms of how the policy is drawn up? And will those companies that are designated sovereign capability be deemed as separate from their parent companies? Because that will have quite a significant bearing on how this policy will operate.
So the policy will apply to the full global footprint of a defence company and all associated activities, i.e. if the specific Scottish part of the company has no links to an identified country but another part of the company elsewhere in the world does, then the Scottish part of the company becomes ineligible for the grants and investments.
That's a useful clarification. And now to hand to Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Deputy First Minister. You talked earlier about your £1.3 billion budget, which is not insignificant, but obviously growing the economy is vital. And I want to get an idea of how there is cooperation across government and recognition the importance of growing the economy and that pooling of budgets and resources to make these things a reality. Do you think we're doing our best in that regard?
I think that we are doing a really good job from an economic perspective. So we bring all the different functions of different parts of government under one umbrella of Team Scotland when it comes to economic decisions. So that creates a tried and tested approach to collaboration. But I think we could always do better. I think if you look even at some of the questions that have been prompted by committee members, there have been questions quite rightly on gender data, questions on climate change, questions on productivity, questions on different sectors. And the challenge for us is always to try and remain as focused as possible and prioritise the areas that we think are going to make the biggest impact. And in a political world, there's always something new to sort of get excited about. And I think what I've tried to do in this role is to just keep going back to what are our core objectives here and to focus in on that. And that makes it much easier to drive collaboration around that. So, for example, skills is one of the areas that businesses always want to talk to me about around the skills. I think we can always do more on skills, but from a skills perspective, from an education perspective, they will be dealing with other objectives, not just the objectives that the businesses that I represent have.
Okay. Some folk are going to think now that my next question is a bit of a patsy one, a plant one, because of your last answer. But I was going to give the example of something that happened this week, the opening of the Energy Transition Skills Hub in Aberdeen. Investment of £4.5 million from the Scottish Government, leveraged in private sector funding from the likes of Shell, being run by NESCOL, all very cooperative and, something that is absolutely vital for the future of the North East economy, and I would argue the whole of Scotland. Now, obviously, that money came from the Just Transition Fund, which I think sits with the Cabinet Secretary for Climate Action and Energy. A huge input in terms of education from the skills aspect and that economic side as well. When those decisions to invest in things like that Energy Transition Skills Hub take place, is there ministerial discussion around about that and, a strategic overview of how much bang we get for our buck?
To an extent. I mean, obviously, in terms of the broader conversations, it all comes back to what we have set out as our core objectives. And in terms of the energy transition, that is one of, if I look at the three main objectives I have around the attracting investment work, one of those is the energy transition. And what investors raise with me, more than they raise anything else, is can you ensure that I'll have the workforce? So therefore, the skills piece underpins all the investment work. So the investment work looks really exciting, and I can talk about the statistics. But ultimately, it only becomes a reality if we've got the skills. So therefore, investing in the energy transition, the energy skills hub, is a really obvious, logical place to make the investment because it is so critical to all the other work that we are trying to do. I chair every few months the Cabinet subgroup on investment and the economy. We had one yesterday. So that's obviously cabinet level importance, but it's a brilliant place where we talk through all the big investment opportunities and what the implications are for every portfolio. So Gillian Martin was there yesterday morning talking about the overlap between the investment approach and the climate change, energy transition, net zero approach that she takes. And then Fiona Hislop's there talking about transport. Ben McPherson is one of the members, talks about skills. So that brings it all together.
Okay. In terms of making sure that we have a workforce fit for the future, the likes of that hub led by the North East of Scotland College is extremely important. And the North East of Scotland College, of course, has been one of those colleges that has adapted well over the years in terms of providing the courses that are required to change to support an ever-changing workforce. So I wonder how much work has gone in between yourself and other colleagues in terms of an audit, and I know this is difficult, an audit of the kind of jobs that we are going to have in the future and the amount of people that we are going to need to staff up those particular sectors. Has that been done? Are we doing enough to adapt in colleges and other places to build that workforce for the future?
So this also feels like it could have been a planted question, because it's the question I was hoping somebody would ask me, and we've had no conversations prior to committee. The audit is something that I have been commissioning for the last few months. So we're doing it on a regional basis. So it may be of interest to committee, to get Skills Development Scotland in front of committee, to go through the audit that they have just done, particularly for the energy transition now this is in the north of Scotland. So there's a big focus on the Highlands and Islands, I'm afraid. But I think that that model could then be replicated for other regions. And what they've done is they have incredibly granular data, because they have started with the inward investors and the businesses currently, rather than just getting high-level figures of we need loads more people and not even we need more engineers. It's, well, tell me specifically how many engineers you need, what kind of engineers you need over the next 10 years, how many welders, what kind of welders. So they have produced, as commissioned and supported through Highlands and Islands Enterprise, they have produced now an industry-led data audit of the skills that are required. And you heard it here first, because I don't think it's in the public domain yet. But the next stage of that is to launch it with commitments from the colleges and universities to how they will support the delivery of every last one of those individuals that are required. So we have done it. I personally think it is better to do it on a regional level, because you're more likely to want to be able to retrain people that live in the locality than to attract people in. And you only will be attracting people in when we know that there's a shortage. So I think that model can then be replicated for other regions, but we've proven it works.
Thank you. In terms of that audit, and you say it's industry-led, does it include the staffing requirements for the future of the public sector as well?
Very interesting. I am unsure if it does. Does anyone else know? I think it's certainly broader than just your obvious industry. For example, it looks at, okay, if we need this many people for the energy transition, how many people do we need to build new houses? So it does go much broader than just the direct jobs. It also talks about the indirect jobs, but I'm not sure it goes as far as the indirect jobs in the public sector, unless Aidan tells me otherwise.
Yeah, that's correct. So it's very industry focused in terms of inward investment opportunities and the jobs required for that. But there's other parallel work that goes on, so for example on health workforce, where they do quite detailed assessments of requirements around all of that feeds in. So there's separate processes around all of that. I guess the challenge is sort of how that all comes together in terms of, you know, the overall collective amount of workers you've got. And that's work around sort of, there is something around there, around the national skills planning approach and what we can do in terms of just making sure that the overall, you know, we get the balance right across the piece. But yeah.
So I'm interested in the fact that you say there's a parallel process with health. And I recognise that obviously this is a new thing, this audit. That's all to the good. But I think in some regards, and you hit upon it yourself, Deputy First Minister, you know, all of that new investment, all of those new skills that are required in the private sector, industry-led, is also going to require a number of other things in a particular area, including, you know, an emphasis in the health workforce. And we know that in certain parts of the country, there are difficulties in terms of recruitment of certain health professionals. So I think that, you know, rather than just a parallel process, maybe as we refine, or you refine this process, that we should look at the entire thing in a holistic manner, including industry, private enterprise, and the public sector.
Yeah. Yep. I think what we've seen with this particular audit is that public sector are very involved. So that's encouraging. But we'll take that point on board.
A final question on this, and that is around about the flexibility of colleges and universities to adapt courses. And as I said earlier, I think in some parts of the country there has been much greater flexibility and the ability to change quite quickly courses to meet the needs of the modern world when it comes to workforces. Has there been in-depth discussions with your education colleagues, skills colleagues, and I realise that Ben McPherson is just in post, around about you know, making all of that much more flexible instead of, in some cases where there has been a traditional mindset not to change anything. And I'll give you an example. You know, some of the bricklaying courses that were on the go a few years ago didn't really meet the modern build standards. So are we having those discussions? Is that going to be something that's going to be driven forward?
Yes. So I have had a lot of conversations in the production of the data audit that I just talked about, the workforce audit, and the big asks from business industry with Ben McPherson's predecessor, Graham Day, and I'm looking forward to picking up those conversations with Ben McPherson at the moment. So yes, a big focus on flexibility. We've seen some evidence of flexibility, and we saw some evidence, for example, around the Clyde Maritime cluster, where it's Glasgow College is being absolutely brilliant in terms of supporting industry ambitions. But it would be good to see that right across Scotland.
Thank you, Deputy First Minister. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Kevin. Well, a skills gap that Gordon MacDonald and I have identified as our ability to lip read in the preceding set of questions. But I now hand over to Gordon MacDonald.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning. I wanted to ask you about AI, so I've got a few questions about AI, and then we're looking for a point of clarification. So, first of all, the Scottish Government has obviously got its forthcoming AI action plan, and that builds upon the AI strategy of 2021. What's taking place in that area at the moment? The committee is going to be carrying out an inquiry on AI, and it'd be helpful to know when that action plan will be ready.
So the AI Scotland programme is very new. So I chaired the AI strategy back in 2021. It had a big focus on ethics and safety and security, and the focus for the AI Scotland programme, which Richard Lochhead leads on, is essentially a pilot scheme for SMEs, and it's all about positioning Scotland as a creator and a supplier of AI technologies. So it's fairly fresh and new, but we could certainly report back to committee on it. Colin?
Happy to try and add to that. As Deputy First Minister said, it is a new initiative, but the government established a technology council recently. That has representatives on it from the AI, with people with, you know, a very deep understanding and commercial and university background in AI. They're helping us to shape that action plan. I would think it will take a few months to develop a plan that we could discuss with this committee, but I can just assure you that people are working on it. And the issue here, of course, is that the whole field is moving so quickly that we need to have that ongoing improvement of what we do. But there are parallels around the world. There are organisations or initiatives such as AI Singapore that we're benchmarking to try and really get an understanding of what might make a difference and what role the public sector could take.
Okay, I mean, 88% of SMEs think that by investing in AI, they will improve their productivity. But those same companies, are, as you mentioned earlier, are spending less on skills. And if AI takes off the way that people think it's going to take off, then you've got the problem of job displacement as well, where retraining is going to be required. So how do we get the balance right between investing in skills and investing in AI, which is needed to help a productivity situation?
So I think the more we do, the better in both areas. If I reflect on anything in Scotland right now, it's that the scale of the growth that is planned or is currently underway exceeds the ability of the workforce to deliver it. In other words, we don't have all the people we need to deliver the scale of industry ambitions right now, as we speak, whether that is through energy transition or what's happening in life sciences or otherwise, or even just construction industry and building houses. So there's a question about continuing to invest in retraining, upskilling and making sure young people come through with the right skills that they need. Secondly, though, I do think it's the size of the workforce. Yeah. So otherwise, you just end up recycling from one industry to another. And that's a big risk on a regional level in particular. You can look at the national figures, but it's a big challenge. And these are problems born of growth. So they are problems born of high demand for workers because of that growth. And it's happening right across the board, whether it's the aerospace cluster in Prestwick or the North East or otherwise. The second on AI is that investing in AI is not really a choice, it's not a luxury. It's a question of keeping up and with other people, with competitors, because that is where other jurisdictions are going, have gone, and we have got to ensure that our SMEs are well equipped, which is where the AI Scotland programme comes from.
And given the importance of AI that you've just indicated, then in order to harness the benefits of AI, we need data centres based in Scotland. We've got a cooler climate and we've got abundance of electricity. So I know we had the recent announcement about Data Vita and CoreWeave, but how do we use that to encourage other companies to put down roots in Scotland and provide the data centres from Scotland?
So we're doing that with a very streamlined approach to attracting the development and the investments. It's a really obvious example in the work we've done through the investment pipeline. So what we've done through the investment pipeline is to have a really tangible sort of prospectus on where investors can invest in Scotland. And one of the obvious areas is data centres. And that is working, I think. We're seeing evidence that it's working. There's some challenges along the way. But for all the reasons you identified, a cooler climate, access to energy. One of the risks is, of course, the high price of energy. But we've got access to a surplus of green energy, or we will have access to a surplus of green energy, which is of interest as well. So those are all driving quite high levels of interest in data centres in Scotland.
Okay. And my final point is just a point of clarification, and it follows on from Stephen Kerr's earlier question where he tried to paint the productivity figure as pretty black in Scotland. Am I right in saying that Scotland's in the top 3 of the 12 UK regions in terms of productivity levels, that Scotland's average growth over the last decade is more than double the UK's, and Edinburgh's productivity is nearly 25% higher than UK average?
Well, I think the members put it all on the record, and I'm happy to be reminded of those wonderful statistics.
Well, just if I may come in with a couple of brief, and I was going to ask these questions anyway, because I think it's actually really important. And the issue here is about context, and I think there's always a different way of looking at the data. But just in terms of those productivity measures in NZ, I know 2 things about their use specifically. First of all, when it was published, there was using 2023 data, but the 2024 data was published just one day later. So I was just wondering two things. First of all, is there an issue here around the sequencing of data so that we can use the most up-to-date? But particularly in terms of productivity data, we're using nominal data. So it quotes an increase of £40.50 productivity of £42.50. And that's described as an increase. But obviously in real terms, after inflation, that's a decrease of 1.5%. Do we need to think about how we are using data and making sure we're using the most up-to-date, but also providing greater context?
Well, the semi-author of the NSET report is sitting beside me, so...
Thank you. Yes, I suppose there's always a challenge with any report, and the date that you publish it, inevitably there's always another figure that comes out just that day or shortly after that means that it's not as up-to-date as it could be. But thanks for flagging that. There is something just around productivity. It's been reflected in the committee's interest in this and its criticality in terms of what we're trying to achieve. So I think just in terms of next year, we'll consider that alongside lots of other factors we have to think about in terms of just publication timescales. I think on nominal, we should have, so I think that should, on reflection, should have said explicitly it was nominal. I mean, I suppose it's implicit, and you flagged that, and that's something to take away. I think I'm right in saying that actually, in terms of real growth over the period we've talked about, it's positive. But I think just in terms of what we're trying to achieve, which is real terms productivity increases, can I take that away?
I mean, it just strikes me that given the centrality of productivity, and for the sake of a day, there's something there to be looked at. But again, in terms of that context, and I recognise the numbers over the 20-year period, but you may have seen the article in the Financial Times in June, which was actually focusing on London's productivity over the last 4 years. And again, this is full declaration here. This is based on ONS data, and unfortunately, the regional breakdowns in ONS data take some time to come through. So it's looking at the period of 2019 to 2023. Now, the focus of the article was actually that London's productivity has decreased in that period, but it also showed very clearly that Scotland's productivity growth, and this is labour productivity growth, was fourth from bottom, narrowly ahead of Wales, then the West Midlands and London, but showing a productivity growth of 0.25% compared to almost 2.5% at the North West, which was leading the pack. And the point here being is, yes, if you look at a longer period, you do that, but actually more recently, there would appear to be some issues with Scotland's productivity when you're looking at those regional comparisons. So, first of all, would you recognise that? And secondly, coming back to the context point, should we be looking more clearly at Scotland's productivity growth in comparison to other regions and nations of the UK?
So I think the questions around productivity are fascinating because of the way in which, over that 20-year period, Scotland did close the gap quite definitively with the rest of the UK, closed the gap significantly in productivity levels with the UK average. So real output per hour in Scotland in 2019 was £34.6 in comparison to £35.4 in the UK as a whole, and we have outperformed all regions of the UK in the 99 to 2019 period. And I talked about the average growth earlier in terms of real output per hour of 1.52% per annum. But the period more recently has been challenging, and there's plenty of Scottish Government reports that go into some detail about that. So the Chief Economist produces some reports. So last year, October 2024, went into some detail about the succession of shocks to our economy, pandemic, high inflation, significant volatility in some of those short-term indicators. And so, again, 2023 productivity fell 1.1% compared to 2022, but it grew 4.6% the previous year. So I think that getting into the figures is important, but it doesn't compensate for actually just understanding what will drive productivity growth, and that is all the areas I outlined to Stephen Kerr. It's business investment, it's investment in digital, it's investment in skills, and I think we are seeing some significant outcomes from those investments that we need to keep supporting.
I mean, I don't disagree with that, but could I just press you a little bit on that point? I mean, I am, again, full declaration, slightly obsessed by these regional breakdowns, because I think that they expose, or at least I think pose the question: are there things going on in other places that we could and should be doing or learning from? And I think particularly albeit there's some reasons to maybe not talk about Manchester given recent days, but I think there are lessons to be drawn from perhaps what they are doing, and should NZ or other things that the Scottish Government use some of these comparisons, whether it's with Manchester or Northern Ireland or with Wales, both for positive and negative insights.
Yeah, so we've talked about this before, and I think what sets Manchester out is strong leadership and cohesive approach to delivering results. That is perfectly possible in Scotland, and I see evidence for that in different parts of Scotland. The one that stands out most starkly, and forgive me because I obviously do have an element of prejudice in this regard, but I have never seen the Highlands and Islands work together so cohesively as I am seeing them now, or with such strong leadership. Largely born of the fact that Highlands and Islands Enterprise is a little bit independent and can do that strong leadership, but then you've got brilliantly strong leaders right now in all the key public bodies, and you've got a sense amongst industry that something exciting is happening, and they are working collaboratively together. So, none of the most recent investments happened accidentally. They were pursued quite intelligently. And that, I would suggest, stands out. The Manchester example is fascinating, but it isn't a model for rural areas. And I would argue now that the Highlands and Islands is showing what it could look like in a rural area, which is quite exciting. I
agree with that. And actually, the point was not so much about the structures per se, but it's more just a kind of the data points and the comparisons. But I believe Stephen Kerr was wanting to make a supplementary as well. Yeah, I want
to make absolutely clear to you and the committee that I'm not trying to paint a black picture of anything. I'm trying to talk about our ambition for Scotland, which I hope we all agree on. That we want to improve our productivity, and that productivity, I believe, and I think this is a shared belief, is a key driver. I was wanting to make the point that it's all right to do the UK relative measurements on whether it's the nations and regions of the United Kingdom, but in fact the UK is a very bad example. It is a very bad example of productivity, and in fact that's why I think, and I just want to hear the Deputy First Minister's response on this, why I think it's important what the convener said about looking at things that are going on in other places, particularly in other countries. In fact, other continents, and seeing what we can learn from there. And I think a little bit more ambition from all of us in respect to our national productivity wouldn't go amiss. I'm sure the Deputy First Minister would agree with that.
Absolutely. And could I just quote, there's a University of Glasgow study on productivity, and I just think this line, if I find it, I had it in front of me. Reflecting upon Scotland's productivity performance is a story of puzzles and apparent contradictions, with strength in some areas but below average performance elsewhere.
That's right.
And then the report goes through what those are in terms of high productivity sectors. I talked about the big beasts. High productivity sectors in energy and finance, world-leading universities, meaning that the skills element is good, but the business ecosystem, this is their report, not my words, the business ecosystem in Scotland lacks a critical mass of large scale-ups.
Yep.
QTech scaler, and some good progress on export performance, but going further and supporting business startups as well. So that there's like a little insight into really solid strengths in one areas, and it kind of goes back to Lorna Slater's point, which is if you want to just take the high level data, it often masks the regional or the industry variation underneath. That was a December 2021 report, I should say.
There's been a number of really excellent reports that explore these paradoxes. But I think we're not unique in that respect either, I mean, in Scotland. And hence, I think the importance of us looking further afield and taking the lessons. Some of them will be quite uncomfortable lessons about the nature and structure of our economy and how we have to be prepared, perhaps, to see a rearrangement of those structures that will help us become more prosperous. I'm sure you agree with some of that.
And again, not to go back to my pet subject of the Highlands and Islands, but Graham Roy did a really interesting report on the Highland economy over the last 60 years. And he was looking largely at the progress since Highland and Islands Development Board time, where, of course, the general accepted wisdom was that the Highlands was such a basket case, the only thing you could do to improve the region was to encourage people to leave rather than to encourage investment in. And I mean, these are quotes that are, I think it's Donald Mackay, economist, made that point. But Graham Roy's point is the productivity growth in the Highlands and Islands has exceeded in at many points what was happening Scotland-wide. And that secondly, they were able to weather some of the economic storms better because of a resilience. So there's also a lot to learn, not just about looking outward, but perhaps looking inward at particular regions of Scotland where there has been significant growth over the last 60 years.
Excellent. Well, with that, I think the Economy Committee is demonstrating excellent productivity by dealing with our agenda ahead of
Hopefully
schedule.
that extends to ministers.
And I think we're
as well.
actually, and I do genuinely think that it's in broad terms that point around wanting to be more ambitious for Scotland and clear-eyed about where the opportunities for improvement is one that we can all agree with. So can I thank the Cabinet Secretary and also Colin Cook and Alan Grisewood for their contributions this morning. I need to remind myself how well we've dealt with our agenda this morning. And with that, we'll move into private session. Thank you very much, Deputy First Minister.